As Lizzie Borden took an axe. Or at least that's how the rhyme goes. Everyone knows it. The story is part of American folklore, a dark little nursery rhyme we learn as kids. It's simple, brutal, and memorable. But the real story is anything but simple. The question isn't just about what happened on that hot August day in 1892. The real question is whether a quiet, church-going woman from a prominent family committed one of the most gruesome crimes imaginable and then walked away, free. Did Lizzie Borden actually get away with murder? To figure that out, you have to go back to Fall River, Massachusetts. It was a mill town, hot and sticky in the summer, and the Borden house on 2nd Street was right in the middle of it. It wasn't a happy home. The family was wealthy, but they didn't live like it. Andrew Borden, the father, was a notorious miser. He was one of the richest men in town, a bank president, but he lived in a modest house without indoor plumbing on the ground floor. They ate old food, like the spoiled mutton stew that was sitting on the stove the week of the murders. There was no sense of comfort or warmth in that house. It was a place of tension. There were 4 people living there. Andrew, his second wife, Abby, and Andrew's 2 adult daughters from his first marriage, Emma and Lizzie. Emma was the older sister, more reserved. Lizzie was 32, unmarried, and considered a spinster. She was active in her church and local charities. On the surface, she was a respectable Victorian woman, but underneath there was deep unhappiness. Lizzie and Emma hated their stepmother, Abby. They never called her mother, they called her Miss Borden. They felt she had married their father for his money. This wasn't just teenage resentment, it was a cold, hard fact of their lives. Years earlier, Andrew had given a property to Abby's sister. The daughters were furious. They saw it as their inheritance being given away. It caused a huge fight, and from then on, the family was split. The daughters ate their meals separately from their parents. The house was a silent battleground. Money was the engine of this conflict. Andrew Borden was rich, but he controlled every penny. Lizzie and Emma were in their 30s and 40s, but they were completely dependent on him. They had no freedom. They lived in a stifling house with a father they respected but didn't seem to love, and a stepmother they openly despised. They dreamed of moving to a nicer part of town, the Hill, where the other wealthy families lived. But Andrew refused to spend the money. Their lives were stuck. The week of the murders, the tension was even higher than usual. The whole family had been violently ill with stomach problems. They thought they were poisoned. Abby even went to a doctor, worried someone was trying to kill them. The house was also full of visitors. John Morse, the brother of Andrew's first wife, was staying over. He and Andrew had been discussing business, likely about property and wills. This kind of talk would have only made the inheritance issue feel more immediate and threatening to Lizzie and Emma. And that brings us to the day itself. August 4th, 1892. It was brutally hot. Emma was out of town visiting friends. That left Andrew, Abby, Lizzie, John Morse, and their live-in maid, Bridget Sullivan. John Morse left early in the morning to visit other relatives. Andrew also went out for his morning business rounds. That left 3 women in the house, Abby, Lizzie, and Bridget. Bridget wasn't feeling well from the sickness. After serving breakfast, Abby told her to wash the outside windows. It was a strange request on such a hot day. While Bridget was outside, Abby went upstairs to the guest room to make the bed where John Morse had slept. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. Sometime between 9 and 9:30 in the morning, someone entered that room. They came up behind Abby as she was bent over making the bed. They struck her from behind with a hatchet or a similar weapon. The first blow was to the side of her head. She fell face down, and the killer kept hitting her. Again and again, 19 times in total. The back of her head was a mangled mess. It was an attack of incredible rage. Downstairs, life went on. Bridget finished the windows and came back inside. Lizzie was around reading a magazine. Andrew Borden came home around 10:30. His key didn't work, so he knocked. Bridget had trouble with the lock, and she later said she heard Lizzie laugh from the top of the stairs as she struggled with it. Finally, she let Andrew in. He went into the sitting room to lie down for a nap on the sofa. Lizzie said she helped him with his boots and put a pillow under his head. This is where the timeline gets tight and very, very important. Lizzie told Bridget that Mrs. Borden had received a note and had gone out to visit a sick friend. She told Bridget she could go up to her room on the 3rd floor to rest, since it was so hot and she was still feeling unwell. Bridget went upstairs around 11 a.m., so now Andrew Borden is asleep on the sofa. Bridget Sullivan is in her attic room, and Lizzie Borden is the only other person in the house. Or so she says. About 10 minutes later, all hell broke loose. Lizzie started screaming. "Bridget! Come down! Father's dead! Someone came in and killed him!" Bridget rushed down the stairs. What she saw was horrific. Andrew Borden was slumped on the sofa, his face completely destroyed. He had been struck with a hatchet about 10 or 11 times. One eye was cut in half. His nose was severed. The wounds were so deep they had cut through bone. Blood was everywhere, still wet and dark. It had just happened. The next few hours were chaos. Neighbors came running. A doctor was called. The police arrived. At first, everyone was focused on Andrew. Lizzie was questioned, but she seemed dazed. She kept talking about a note Abby had received saying she had gone out. But where was Abby? Lizzie suggested someone check upstairs. A neighbor and Bridget went up. They walked into the guest room and found her. They saw the body on the floor, the blood already dark and congealed. The doctor confirmed Abby had been dead for at least an hour and a half, maybe longer. This was the first major problem for Lizzie's story. If Abby was killed around 9:30 a.m. and Andrew was killed around 11 a.m., it meant two separate, brutal murders happened in the same house an hour and a half apart. The story of a random intruder, a robber or a maniac, started to fall apart. What kind of killer murders someone, waits in the house for 90 minutes, and then kills someone else? And how do they do it without Bridget or Lizzie seeing or hearing anything? The police investigation was, by modern standards, a complete mess. They let neighbors and family friends wander through the crime scene. Evidence was contaminated. Dr. Bowen, the family doctor, was allowed to tend to Lizzie in her room away from police questioning. The initial search of the house was not thorough, but even with all the confusion, the focus quickly narrowed to one person, Lizzie. Her stories didn't add up. She gave conflicting accounts of where she was during the murders. At first, she said she was in the dining room reading a magazine when her father came home. Later, she said she might have been in the kitchen. She told police that during the time her father was killed, she had gone out to the barn in the backyard. She said she was looking for lead sinkers to use for fishing. She said she was in the barn loft for about 20 or 30 minutes eating pears. But the police who investigated the barn found it was stiflingly hot up in the loft. The air was thick with dust, and they couldn't see any footprints in the dust, suggesting no one had been up there recently. Why would she spend half an hour in a sweltering barn loft for no good reason? It sounded like a weak alibi. Then came the issue of a weapon. Police searched the house for a bloody axe. In the basement, they found several axes and hatchets. One in particular drew their attention. The head of a hatchet was found in a box of old tools. The wooden handle was broken off and nowhere to be found. The head itself looked like it had been recently washed and rubbed in ash, as if to make it look old and unused. The prosecution would later argue this was the murder weapon. The killer had broken off the bloody handle and hidden it, then cleaned the head to disguise it. But the most damning evidence against Lizzie came from her own actions, both before and after the murders. The day before the killings, on August 3rd, Lizzie went to a local pharmacy. She tried to buy prussic acid, a deadly poison. She told the pharmacist she needed it to clean a sealskin cape. The pharmacist refused to sell it to her without a prescription. This was a bombshell. It suggested premeditation. She was trying to get poisoned just hours before her parents were hacked to death. Was this her first plan, a quieter murder that she abandoned for the axe? And then, a few days after the murders, Lizzie did something that sealed her fate in the court of public opinion. Her friend, Alice Russell, was staying with the Borden sisters for support. On Sunday morning, Alice came downstairs and saw Lizzie in the kitchen standing in front of the stove. Lizzie was tearing up a blue corduroy dress. Alice asked what she was doing. Lizzie said the dress was old and had paint on it, so she was going to burn it. Alice was horrified. "Lizzie, I wouldn't let anybody see me do that," she warned. She knew how it would look. The police were desperate for evidence. Burning a dress, any dress, was the most suspicious thing she could possibly do. So Lizzie ignored her and burned the dress anyway. When the police found out, it became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. They argued the dress wasn't stained with paint. It was stained with blood. Lizzie had worn that dress during the murders, and she burned it to destroy the primary piece of physical evidence linking her to the crime. Lizzie's explanation that it was just an old paint-stained dress seemed incredibly weak. The timing was just too perfect, so the case against Lizzie was built on these pillars. She had the motive hatred for her stepmother and a desire for her father's fortune and the freedom it would bring. She had the opportunity. She was the only person who was definitely in the house during both murders besides the victims. Her alibi was weak and unbelievable. She had no credible emotional reaction, appearing calm and collected to some, which was seen as unnatural. She had a history of strange behavior, including shoplifting. She tried to buy poison the day before. And she destroyed a key piece of potential evidence by burning her dress. For the police and the prosecutor, it was an open and shut case. Lizzie Borden was a cold-blooded killer. Her inquest testimony was a disaster. She was questioned for days while reportedly on morphine for her nerves. Her answers were confusing, contradictory, and evasive. She claimed to have no memory of key moments. She couldn't say where she was when her stepmother was being killed. She couldn't give a straight answer about her movements before her father was found. This testimony painted her as a liar and made her look even more guilty. The trial of Lizzie Borden began in June of 1893. It was a national sensation. Newspapers from all over the country sent reporters. The public was fascinated by the idea of a gentlewoman, a churchgoer, being accused of such a savage crime. The courtroom was packed every day. The prosecution felt they had a strong circumstantial case. They laid out all the evidence, the family tensions, the poison attempt, the inconsistent alibi, the burned dress. They brought Bridget Sullivan to the stand to establish the timeline. They brought the pharmacist to testify about the prussic acid. They presented the handleless hatchet head as the murder weapon. Their argument was simple: no one else could have done it. The doors were locked, there was no sign of a break-in, no one saw a mysterious stranger enter or leave the house. Only Lizzie had the motive and the opportunity. But Lizzie had an expensive, high-powered legal team, her dream team. Her lead lawyer was George Robinson, the former governor of Massachusetts. They knew they couldn't just rely on the facts. They had to build a different kind of defense. Their strategy was brilliant and perfectly tailored to the prejudices of the era. They argued that it was simply unthinkable that a woman of Lizzie Borden's class and character could commit such a crime. They attacked the prosecution's case piece by piece. They argued that the police investigation was incompetent. They created doubt about every single point. The handleless hatchet, they showed that the break in the handle was old. And they produced a witness who said the police had been seen carrying a hatchet into the house, implying it could have been planted. The poison testimony, the defense argued it was irrelevant to a murder committed with an axe, and the judge agreed. He threw out the prussic acid evidence, a huge blow to the prosecution. The defense's biggest challenge was the lack of any other suspects. So they created one. They hinted that an unknown enemy of Andrew Borden, who was a famously ruthless businessman, could have snuck into the house. They created the idea of an intruder, a madman, who committed the crimes. It wasn't a strong theory, but it planted a seed of doubt. Their most powerful weapon, however, was Lizzie herself. They presented her as a frail, grieving daughter. She dressed in black, she sat in court, quiet and sad. At a key moment, when the skulls of her parents were presented as evidence, Lizzie fainted. It was a dramatic moment that swayed public sympathy. How could this delicate woman be a brutal killer? The defense also had a powerful scientific argument on their side: the complete lack of blood. The murders were incredibly bloody. The killer would have been spattered with it. Yet, when the first neighbors arrived just minutes after Andrew's murder, Lizzie's dress was perfectly clean. There was not a single drop of blood on her clothes, or on her skin. The prosecution suggested she might have worn some kind of coverall, like a raincoat, but there was no evidence of that. How did she commit these frenzied, bloody attacks and emerge spotless? This was the biggest hole in the prosecution's case, and the defense hammered it home. And what about the burned dress? The defense brought witnesses who testified that Lizzie had, in fact, been planning to get rid of that old dress for weeks. They framed it not as a guilty act, but as an innocent, if poorly timed, bit of housekeeping. In his closing argument, Governor Robinson didn't focus on the facts. He focused on emotion and social class. He appealed directly to the all-male jury's sense of chivalry and their Victorian ideals of womanhood. He asked them, "To find her guilty, you must believe her to be a fiend. Gentlemen, does she look it?" He was asking them to look at the quiet, well-bred woman sitting before them and decide if she was capable of that kind of butchery. The jury was out for only 90 minutes. They came back with a verdict: not guilty. The courtroom erupted, Lizzie was free, but the story doesn't end there. Because getting away with it legally is not the same as being free. Lizzie and Emma inherited their father's considerable fortune. They finally got what they wanted. They bought a large modern mansion up on the hill and named it Maplecroft. They had servants and lived in the style they had always craved, but they were social outcasts. The people of Fall River had made up their minds. They believed she was guilty. She was shunned. Children would follow her in the street chanting the famous rhyme. She was never truly accepted into the high society she wanted to join. A few years later, Lizzie and Emma had a bitter falling out. No one knows for sure what it was about, but some rumors say it was over Lizzie's friendship with an actress, which was considered scandalous at the time. Emma moved out of Maplecroft and never spoke to Lizzie again. Lizzie lived the rest of her life in that big house, mostly alone. She died in 1927. She was buried in a family plot next to her father, her sister, and the stepmother she was accused of murdering. So, did she get away with it? Almost everyone who has studied the case in depth, from a modern perspective, believes she did. The circumstantial case is overwhelming. The idea of an intruder is almost impossible to believe. The timeline, the motive, the weak alibi, and the burned dress all point directly to Lizzie. So, how did she do it? How did she avoid getting blood on herself? This is the great puzzle of the case. Three theories abound. One popular idea is that she committed the murders while completely naked. Then, she would have had time to wash herself and get dressed before she discovered her father's body. It's a shocking idea, but it would explain the lack of blood evidence. It's impossible to prove, but it fits the facts. Who else could have done it? Over the years, people have pointed fingers at other suspects. Some think Bridget, the maid, might have been involved. Andrew Borden was not an easy employer. Maybe she snapped. But Bridget had no real motive, and her testimony was consistent. Her alibi for the time of Andrew's murder, being in her attic room, was solid. Others have suggested John Morse, the uncle. He had been talking business with Andrew. Maybe they had a violent disagreement, but his alibi for the time of the murders was verified. He was seen all over town visiting relatives. A more fringe theory suggests Emma, the older sister, was the mastermind. The theory goes that Emma came back to Fall River in secret, committed the murders, and left again while Lizzie helped cover it up. But there is zero evidence to support this. It's pure speculation. When you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And in the Borden case, all other possibilities seem impossible. Only Lizzie remains. The prosecution in 1893 simply couldn't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury that was culturally incapable of seeing a woman like Lizzie as a monster. They failed to show the jury the deep well of rage that must have been simmering beneath her quiet exterior. A rage born of years of frustration, resentment, and confinement. A rage that finally exploded on that hot August morning. The first murder, Abby's, was likely a crime of pure passion. Lizzie hated her. Finding her alone and vulnerable in that upstairs room presented an opportunity. The 19 blows show a personal, frenzied anger. The murder of her father, however, might have been different. It was almost a necessity. Once Abby was dead, her father was the only witness who would know Lizzie was in the house. He had to be silenced for her to have any chance of getting away with it. The number of blows, while still high, was less than with Abby. It was brutal, but it was also a means to an end. She got away with it because the system was not ready for a killer like her. The police were clumsy, the forensics were non-existent, and the jury was blinded by their own prejudices about class and gender. They saw a respectable spinster, not a person capable of extreme violence. Her defense team masterfully exploited those biases. But her acquittal was not a victory. She won her freedom in court, but she lost it in the world. She lived as a prisoner of her own reputation. She got the money and the mansion, but she lived a lonely, isolated life. Perhaps that was her real sentence. She was never punished by the law, but she was punished by the community every single day for the rest of her life. The story endures because it's a perfect mystery. There is no confession, no smoking gun that survived. There is only a mountain of circumstantial evidence and the enduring, chilling image of a quiet daughter, a bloody axe, and a crime that sits on the boundary of the believable. Legally, Lizzie Borden was innocent. But in the quiet judgment of history, she is the woman who took an axe, got everything she ever wanted, and paid for it with a lifetime of infamy. She got away with murder, but she never truly got away.